Hello and welcome. This is Daniel, and welcome to another video made exclusively for YouTube. Now, in this video, I'm very excited to be starting a new series that I hinted at in previous videos. And in this series, I will be examining common mistakes, the most common mistakes that chess players in the beginner and intermediate levels tend to make. And I haven't decided yet how many of these videos I'll produce, but probably it'll be on the order of 10. And what I'll do is each video will be dedicated to one particular mistake that is very, very common at the beginner and club player levels. And in order to illustrate this mistake, I'll draw on my own tournament experience. I'll show how I was frequently the one committing these mistakes, what I learned from these games in which I committed them, and how we can learn from that experience in order to try to minimize those mistakes. So without further ado, I present to you the first mistake that I'd like to talk about, which in short is forgetting that tactics in the end game exist. Now let's unpack that statement for a second. What does that mean? Well, I'm not going to delve too deeply into defining what an end game is. You probably have a good understanding of what that is. It's a position generally without queens and generally with a limited amount of material on the board. And when there is a limited amount of material on the board, what generally tends to happen is that, because of the limited resources, players assume that you can kind of switch off your tactical detector. There's going to be no danger to the kings. There's going to be no abundance of tactical threats, no combinations, no sacrifices, and all of that stems from the fact that, well, other than the king, there's simply not that many pieces left on the board. And it's crucial to remember that endgames are hotbeds of tactics and combinations. And even though there might not be a lot of pieces left on the board, tactics are still extremely prevalent, and you have to keep your tactical detector switched on even when you think that you're safe. And the position in front of you is a great illustration of that. It's a game that I will never forget. Now, in this position, I had the black pieces against an international master from France, Anthony Belèche, and we're looking at it from Anthony's perspective. This game was played in Philadelphia in 2009. As you can see, I was rated approximately 2,300, so I was already pretty high rated, and I had played a very, very good game and reached an end game that, in my mind, was very easily drawn. Now, what immediately should jump out at you is the fact that white is up a pawn. However, it's a pretty lame pawn, if I may say so myself. It's this H pawn, and there's very, very few pieces left on the board. Now, if you have a nodding acquaintance with theoretical endgames, that you will know that simply having an H pawn and kings is a dead draw. So trades here are in black's favor. And I figured that if I could just rid myself of the immediate threats, then I should have no problem securing a draw. And of course, I was right. Now, the next question is, well, what are these immediate threats? Let's imagine that it's white to move in this position. Pause the video for a second, try to figure out what it is that white's going to do here. Well, it's not too hard to realize that white has a very, very serious threat. He's threatening to play rook h4 check. King has to move to g8, and now white has checkmate, knight e7 checkmate. So you can see that checkmates do arise in the endgame, and notice how the king on g6 is facilitating this whole enterprise. Without the king, black's king would have had an escape square on f7. Now, of course, I saw this. I didn't miss this because I also knew my opponent had played rook b4. I smelled a rat, and so I figured he was threatening checkmate. Now, I thought, okay, all that I really need to do is cut into this mechanism somehow. Now, I figured, well, I can't really defend the square on h4. So what I can do, I thought, is I can protect the e7 square. And so I played the very sensible looking move, rook to e8. And my idea was that after rook h4 check, king g8, my opponent would no longer be able to give me a check on e7 with the knight. That would simply give up the knight. And all other attempts that my opponent has in this position fall by the wayside. If he goes knight f6 check, well, it looks like a fork, but the reality is I just take, then I swing my rook back. Now, in future videos, I'll talk about these types of endgames. For now, suffice it to say that black is a very, very easy draw. Because white simply cannot make progress, black's going to give a bunch of checks on the back of the board to the white king. And once again, rook trades are in black's, or the rook trade is in black's favor. So I would have had no problem securing the draw here. So, and if white doesn't go, if after a rook to e8, in this position, white doesn't go knight f6, and let's say white swings his rook to g4, for example, well, white is actually liable to get even a worse position, because I'm going to give him a check on e6. I'm going to push the king back from g6, and white actually has to be careful here to make a draw, because if he plays king f5, once again, never switch off your tactical detector. Rook e5 check is a fork. King has to move back, rook takes d5, and now white has a very arduous task of making a draw in this position, which, by the way, is possible, but not easy. And if in this position, after rook e6 check, white goes king h5, well, among other things, black can simply go rook h6 check, skewering the king and picking off the pawn, and draw agreement is on the cards. Now, in playing rook e8, I had only checked that I was stopping the threat of rook h4 knight e7. And I had also made sure that the move king f7 simply ran into rook f8 check, and essentially white has to go back. But what I didn't do was explicitly check for other tactics. I had only thought of it in the sense of defending the e7 square. I didn't stop for a second and say, wait a minute, let me look for some other tactical possibilities in this position. And it turns out that white has an absolutely stunning tactical idea that turns the tables and actually wins the game for white. Once again, I encourage you here to pause the video, take your time, and try to come up with this dastardly move that my opponent sprung on me in this position. Now, hopefully, you were able to switch on that tactical detector of yours and realize that black's king is actually still very much in grave danger. Now, the key insight that I failed to make is that the rook, the black rook, is tied to the 8th rank. Now, what does that mean, it's tied to the 8th rank? Well, that means if the rook moves anywhere along this e-file, let's imagine that the rook ends up on e1, well, then white has back rank checkmate. Black has... Apologies for this. Not sure what this is. Whoa. Okay. My computer is acting up. There we go. I think we're good now. White has rook b8 check, and it's back rank checkmate. I can make the very effective defensive move rook e8 followed by bishop f8. Black is very close to drawing, but unfortunately rook takes f8 wins the game. And that might not seem like it's important, but in fact it's extremely important. Why is it extremely important? Because white can use the fact that the rook is tied down to play the brilliant move knight e7. And when this move was played, I realized immediately what was going on. Now, what is going on? Well, white has posed the familiar threat of checkmating on the side of the board with rook h4. Okay? And black simply has no way of stopping that without giving up his bishop, for example, which is, of course, disastrous. In addition, white is still going to checkmate black on h4. That doesn't even help. And if I take on e7, and of course this is what I missed, then white has rook b8 check with checkmate to follow. And if you look at this position closely, it's hard to believe, but there's nothing that black can do. Black cannot muster up sufficient resources to stop both threats at the same time. If he tries bishop h6, well, that doesn't help because white takes on h6. And if I take the knight now, nothing's changed. This is still checkmate after rook e8, rook takes e8. So amazingly, the move knight e7 wins the game for white. And I simply, after staring at the position for a couple of minutes, resigned. Now, if we go back to this position, with that understanding, we can now, let me just remove these arrows to make it easier to visualize, to make it easier to look at this position. This arrow doesn't want to, this arrow doesn't want to leave. Let me try to make it red first. Make it green first. It's okay, whatever. I'll just leave this arrow. Oh, that's because it's white's most recent move. That's why. Chessbase has this thing where it just shows you the most recent move with an arrow. What could black have done here? Well, had I realized that the king needs a lot of space, there's a lot of moves here that draw. I could play the move rook to a8. And the idea is that knight e7 now meets with rook a6 check, pushing the king out of g6. Black could even play the move rook to f1. And the idea is that rook b8 check meets with rook f8. White hasn't gained anything, and if white goes rook h4 check, king g8, knight e7, well, this is no longer checkmate, as it used to be, because black has vacated this f8 square for his king. If white goes knight e7 here, trying to set up the same threats, well, again, very clearly, this is not the same thing, because black can push off white's king with rook g1 check, and then black is going to have the h7 square for his king. So there were a lot of moves here that drew. I could have moved the rook on the 8th file. On the 8th rank, I could have moved the rook on the F file. All of that would have drawn anything except the move that I played. So if you think about it, I think that the root cause of this mistake wasn't just a random blunder. It was the fact that I wasn't checking for mating tactics in this endgame other than the immediate threat of rook h4, because I assumed that due to the limited resources my opponent had, there wouldn't be any such combination even possible. And that is a big mistake that I see made in a lot of games by a lot of players. As soon as a lot of pieces come off the board, they stop looking for checkmates, they stop looking for combinations, they stop looking for sacrifices, they stop looking for attacks on the king. All of those things are very much prevalent in endgames. In fact, a single king and pawn can already mount an attack on the enemy king. That may sound absurd, but hopefully this example has convinced you otherwise. And I remember that evening I was incredibly upset after this game, but I never forgot that lesson from that game on. And although I still blunder a lot in the endgame, it rare is the occasion now that I forget to check for tactics and for combinations, even with a very limited amount of pieces on the board. So this was our sort of first common mistake that we've discussed, which is forgetting to check for tactics in the endgame. I hope that you've enjoyed this video and this example. In future videos, we'll be talking about other mistakes. We'll be looking at other examples. This, of course, is still a little bit experimental for me, but I hope that everybody was able to take something out of it. And even if not, then perhaps you just enjoyed this nice little combination. I think knight e7 really is a beautiful move. In retrospect, of course. I didn't think so during the game. In any case, I hope you enjoyed. I would very much look forward to hearing from you in the comments below. Any kind of constructive criticism is very much welcomed, as this is a new series. And above all, whatever you do, remember, do not forget to check for tactics in the endgame. Thank you.